9:35 on Thursday, June 14th. Welcome to our regularly scheduled Transportation Policy Board. My name is Rob Johnson. I'm the chair of the committee. We've got a pretty quick agenda today where we'll be spending a little time talking about our regional transportation plan implementation with a focus on transit and bike and ped accessibility, and then adjourning to come back and have a more robust discussion in July about some of the Federal Highway Administration funding and FTA funding, as well as our annual adjustments. So in the interest of time, why don't we start with around the table introductions. Madam Vice Chair.
Becky Erickson, Mayor, City of Paulsbo, representing Kitsap Transit.
Ron Lucas, Mayor of the Town of Stillicum, representing other cities and towns, Pierce County.
Terry Ryan, Snohomish County Council, representing Community Transit.
Paul Roberts, Everett City Council member and representing Puget Sound Clean Air Agency as well.
Trinity Parker, Sound Transit, representing Transportation Operators Committee.
Kelsey Mesher, representing Transportation Choices Coalition.
Jesse Hamish, I'm at Pierce County, representing the Regional Staff Committee.
Davina Dewar, Bothell City Council, representing King County, other cities and towns.
Janet Ray, AAA Washington, representing business.
Kate Cruller, Council Member, City of Tukwila, and representing Sound Cities Association, which is 38 cities.
Kelly McGurty, PSRC staff.
Russ Blunt, 5 Public Works Director, representing Regional Project Evaluation Committee.
Blake Trask, Cascade Bicycle Club, representing Community Environment.
Patty Rubstell, Assistant Secretary, WashDOT.
Rob Berman from HDR Engineering, representing the Seattle Chamber.
Beck Ashby, Port Orchard City Council, representing other cities, Kitsap.
Good morning, Kevin Gorman, Council Member, City of Bremerton.
Thanks, everybody, for being here in person. I know we've got several folks on the phone. Councilmember Doug Richardson, are you there? How about Councilmember John Clausen? How about Councilmember Deb Nelson?
I'm here.
Good morning, Deb. Mayor Dana Ralph, are you on the line?
I am here.
Good morning. Councilmember Stephanie Wright, are you on the line? Anybody on the line that I missed?
Rob Gelder, Kitsap County.
Good morning, Commissioner. Anyone else?
Ryan Mello, Tacoma City Council, representing Pierce Transit.
Good morning, Council Member. Anybody else? Okay, seeing none, I want to take advantage of a quick moment to welcome Kelsey Mesher in your first meeting as the representative of Transportation Choices Coalition, representing Community Environment. I know you're no stranger to this body, but welcome wearing a different hat from a different organization. We usually, as you know, like to take a moment to allow new members to sing a few bars if you'd like, so you're more than welcome to, or you can just give me the wave and say happy to be here.
Happy to be here. I was formerly with Cascade Bicycle Club, and so, my heart is very much in active transportation as well as transit, and excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Just as the report of the chair, I want to say grateful to many of you who attended the General Assembly a couple of weeks ago. At that General Assembly meeting, we had an affirmative vote by 99% of the body in favor of the transportation plan that we spent so many days, weeks, and months here working on. So I want to thank the body for the good work, and I think that 99% approval is about as good as we could have possibly gotten. I'm not sure that puppies and kittens get 99% approval rating. So thank you to you all for the time and energy that you put into that, and I'm glad to have gotten that one securely across the finish line. Anything you'd like to add, Madam Vice Chair?
No, it was a really good event, and I also want to give kudos to our chair. And Rob, you did a great job with the reach out during the process to develop the plan. Remember all those little meetings where we broke out and we discussed and we had little pieces of candy to determine which way we went? It's very helpful to get that kind of information earlier on to incorporate it into the plan. And that was Rob's idea, and it was a good one. And so feeling very proud that it went as seamlessly as it did.
Thank you very much. Without further ado, then, let's open it up for public comment. Alex Zimmerman, you're the first person who signed up. Please come forward. You have 2 minutes.
Heil, my dirty double-A Führer, a Nazi social democratic mafia with progressive Gestapo principle. My name Alex Zimmerman and I'm president of Stand Up America. I'm very happy so you recognize so you 100% natural born degenerate idiot. Everybody identical. It's not surprise me what has happened in Seattle a couple days ago about tax head. That's not about Amazon. 80% people don't like government and crook like you. 80% is a huge revolution what is don't have analogy, what is I don't know analogy. For changes need 3-5%. 80% people in Seattle don't like you. It's not surprise me, and I talk about this for many years, 1,600 times. Fascism cannot go forever. You guys more dangerous than Nazi or communist because you bring a pure 100% fascism in Seattle, in King Country, in Washington State. Unique situation. All America reflect right now this. All America know right now about what's happened a couple days ago in City Council. Guys, you understand what is you go? I don't think so you understand because you're very happy, so 100% identical idiot. You are a cretina. But not simple cretina, you suck blood and money from us, each from you. You need to understand this, it's only beginning. Because revolution when start, never stop, and before don't clean you totally. Maybe need another 250 years, I'm not too much sure about this. But we need cleanse this dirty chamber from crook like you, from criminal, a bandita, racketeering, and totally don't have sense idiot. It's America. We're supposed to be stand up. I speak right now to everybody. Stand up. Cleanse this dirty chamber from this fascist. Thank you.
Mr. Locke, you're next. We've got a microphone coming to you.
I'm Paul W. Locke. I'm interested in your item 6. I've been listening to the news, and we're killing more pedestrians and bicyclists and others because we have done something with this traffic lanes and that gets them to do things that they weren't doing. The last 2 days I heard that somebody got run over trying to get across one of our intersections in the city. I think you, in this discussion, should be taking into consideration of what your actions are in making these bicycle lanes and other things that you've made changes in to cause these things. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Locke. You were the last person to sign up, so we'll now close public comment and move on to Kelly McGurty for our staff report. Kelly.
Thank you. Good morning. I will be brief. I want to draw your attention to the information item. This is the first time we've done this, so as the chair mentioned, we will be back in front of you next month with the recommendations for project funding through our project selection process. We have about $530 million coming our way, and the information item shares with you that we had about 254 projects in total submitted for our 2 years worth of funding, representing a total of about $867 million, chasing after that $530 million. We provided some information on the types of projects, the phases, and we just want to start telling that story a little bit more. When we come back in July with the project recommendations, we will do our best to provide some contextual information about the types of projects you're seeing, where they're located, the types of projects, etc. The other thing I wanted to note is that we learned a few weeks ago that we actually got a little bit of a boost in our Federal Highway Administration dollars, which is a bit unexpected but welcome. In the 2018 spending bill through Congress, they moved some general fund dollars over to the Highway Trust Fund, and that trickled down through the state. So Washington State got about $34 million, and our region got about 9.5. So we went ahead and followed that process, and since we were in the thick of project selection, it seemed like a good thing to go ahead and add that to the list. So those dollars are incorporated. It's a small amount, but every dollar helps. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that, and more to come next month. And the other thing, just to cue up the meeting today, is now that the plan has been adopted, we are ready to go, working on those implementation items. Today is one aspect of that related to both our active transportation plan as well as our transit access and parking strategy. But more will come over the next few months. We have actions related to freight, to technology, to finance, and a number of other things. So with that, I will conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Any questions or thoughts, colleagues? I'm not seeing any. And Gil Cerise has joined at the table. Gil, before we get to you, we have to do one small action today. Casey, do we have a quorum to be able to adopt today's consent agenda? Would anyone like to remove, please?
I'll make a motion to accept the consent agenda.
Excellent. It's been seconded by Councilmember Roberts. Further discussion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Aye. Passes unanimously. Thank you all. As Kelly mentioned, one of the discussion points that we had in the adoption of the plan was to start talking about implementation and maybe bringing back some modal-specific concepts and some of the good work that has been happening in local governments and in think tanks around the region to continue to inspire innovation and collaboration amongst our many different jurisdictions. So with that, Gil Cerise is going to walk us through a little bit of implementation strategies and bring up some of our local guest speakers to talk about some of the projects that are of interest and should be of interest to you.
Thank you. Yes, this is a great opportunity for us now that we've adopted the Regional Transportation Plan to bring some information to you on, as was mentioned, the theme today, kind of bicycle and pedestrian accessibility, and its how it connects with regional transit access. So today's presentation will go over our regional transit access and parking strategy that's part of the recently adopted Regional Transportation Plan. We'll review the active transportation plan that addresses bicycle and pedestrian planning and implementation in the region. Our coordinated plan is also another place where this is a good nexus for that as well, where it addresses people who have difficulty traveling due to age, income, or disability. And then we'll go over some current work, kind of a broad overview of what transit agencies do, as well as some work that PSRC is engaging in. And then end it off with a couple of local agency highlights. So with that, I'll get started with our regional our transit access and parking strategy is basically, there's been some work going on in this area for the last few years. In fact, I think that work was initiated through Transportation 2040 in 2010. There was some language in that plan about park and rides and access that resulted in a transit access assessment and some additional work on a checklist and toolkit for transit access. The strategy that's in the plan today was called for through that work, and it establishes several guiding principles. I won't go into those in detail, but you can see them in the plan. They include things like collaboration and how key that is. Access to transit is not just a transit agency responsibility or a local jurisdiction responsibility. It's a collaboration between those entities as well as the state and others where applicable. So that's an example of one of the guiding principles that are in there. The three major elements of the strategy itself include maximizing non-SOV or non-single occupancy vehicle access to transit, and that's a wide range of things in that strategy. We'll be honing in on the bicycle and pedestrian access element today, but that also includes things like everything from building transit-oriented development close to transit access to working with transportation network companies or TNCs to provide that first last mile. Some different things like that are in that element of the maximizing non-SOV access to transit. The second part there is the managing parking demand at the region's most used park and rides. And there's some work already ongoing. Transit agencies, Sound Transit and King County Metro have been working over the last couple of years. They have a program where they're looking at, they have carpool permits at their most used park and rides, some of the ones that are at capacity or over capacity. And they've been working on that for the last couple of years. And in addition, PSRC has a parking management working group to kind of help convene and facilitate the work between all the different transit agencies. That's an ongoing group that we convene. In fact, there's a meeting coming on later this month where they're going to look at that carpool parking permit program and see what findings have happened there so far and talk about next steps. The third element of the strategy is adding strategic parking capacity. So our plan includes additional park and ride spaces as the different transit agencies are adding, building out Sound Transit, a high-capacity transit network, and other long-range plans. There are parking assumptions in there to add parking access for park and rides. But also, this strategy includes other kind of low-cost or innovative methods of addressing parking without building it itself. So everything from leased lots, where you can find a parking nearby that is not utilized at the same times that park and rides are, to lease those lots, or else King County Metro recently had a study in terms of looking at multifamily parking or multifamily developments near transit hubs and identifying where those multifamily developments have underutilized parking. That might provide an opportunity for a win-win between the transit agency and the property owner to make some of that parking available to the transit. So this is just a broad overview of our transit access and parking strategy. The specific one shown here, this is the language from that strategy that addresses the bicycle and pedestrian investments that we're talking about today. And really, the key here is it's making it safe, easy, and comfortable as possible for people to walk and ride bicycles to their transit hubs is kind of the key element of this strategy. And this is something that we, again, will be implementing in collaboration with our transit agency partners and local jurisdictions and through the other plans that I'll be going through in the next couple of slides. Our active transportation plan, again, is the place where this is a plan that provides a framework for us to implement, the region to implement active transportation. It provides, suggests local actions for our agencies in the region to implement active transportation, but it also provides some PSRC work program elements. We'll go over one of those shortly that helps with that local agency implementation of active transportation planning and programming. The keys to this, one of the key goals of the plan, this is not the key goal, is to provide increased and safer access to transit for more people. So there's several key goals, but that's one of those. The main elements of the active transportation plan is it relies on connectivity, safety, and comfort for these modes, and making sure that they're things that people really want to do and have no barriers to accessing transit through those modes. And we'd be remiss to go over the coordinated plan, where this is, again, the plan that addresses seniors, youth, people with disabilities, and low income. And again, bicycling and walking are very important for those groups as well. And so this coordinated plan addresses a wide variety of ways of improving transportation for those groups. Some key examples here are with infrastructure gaps. And so if a person with disabilities transporting from their home to the local bus stop, if there's not an ADA accessible ramp on the sidewalk, they can't make that trip. And being able to access the fixed route transit system provides a lot of freedom for those folks. They don't have to then call and have a demand response, a van come pick them up at a certain time. So ability to fill in those gaps in infrastructure, being able to put those ADA curb ramps or fill in a gap in the sidewalk network is really key for that mobility. Another example being pedestrian crossings, where the light for the pedestrian to get across, sometimes one of the issues there is that it's not long enough for a frail elderly person to get across the street. So those are the kinds of issues that are addressed in the coordinated plan. So in terms of current work, the transit agencies it's very important for transit agencies in terms of accessing transit by bicycle and pedestrian modes. It's, again, a collaboration between transit agencies and local jurisdictions. It's not one agency alone. But transit agencies typically will work with their local jurisdictions on corridor plans, things like that, to make sure that pedestrians and bicycles are accounted for and accessing transit, or through development when development comes in. But some of the key ways they're working systematically on this is that with the high-capacity transit, as link light rail is being built out, Sound Transit's looking at how those stations are sited and how they are accessible to people in the surrounding community for bicycle and pedestrians. So that's one of the ways that they're looking at it. And then agencies that are either have or are planning for their bus rapid transit. I list King County Metro's Rapid Ride and Community Transit for Swift, but also Pierce Transit's working on a bus rapid transit program on Pacific Avenue, SR7. And as they do that, they are typically addressing pedestrian access at those corridors and at those bus stops as well. So those are just some ways that transit agencies are already working on this. At PSRC, one of the key issues that we've identified in working with both the transit agencies and the Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee is the issue of sidewalk data. And This is one area where we have data in the region that's inconsistently managed or shown. There's also gaps in the data, and in some cases, even data that's out there is just really old and not kept up. So there's a wide variety of issues with sidewalk data in general. Why is this a problem? Well, as we look at transit as a system, it doesn't just go from one jurisdiction, or it typically crosses multiple jurisdictions. So as you're looking at things like trying to do a systematic approach to, for the example of the person with a disability, trying to identify those gaps in the sidewalk that make it impossible for them to reach, for a person with disability to reach a transit stop, being able to look at pedestrian access systematically is difficult when that data is either non-existent or inconsistent across the region. So that's the issue. And so looking at trying to identify a comprehensive and consistent sidewalk data set would be a benefit to the region. PSRC is proposing to address this in part through a, this is again kind of as we implement the active transportation plan, this is where it's an example of these are local actions for jurisdictions are typically the ones that do the sidewalk data, but this is an opportunity for us to kind of help out and look at that in a region-wide level. So we're proposing a sidewalk data pilot project. The Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee is kind of taking the lead on this with feedback from the Transportation Operators Committee. We're proposing to collect data at 4 locations across the region where there's data gaps or inconsistencies, and because we're going to emphasize access to transit, we're working with the Transportation Operators Committee to identify locations within a half mile of key transit stations, either an existing station or a proposed station, and it probably will be one in each of the 4 counties in terms of the 4 locations. The goal here is to develop a consistent method and a way of recording sidewalk data across the region, and that would get at that issue that we talked about in terms of being able to systematically look at sidewalk data and pedestrian access across the region. The next steps for this project, we'll be looking at collection at the 4 locations over the summer of 2018. And then again, we're not proposing to do sidewalk collection at all throughout the region. This is a pilot for just a few locations. So we're going to turn those the results of the findings for those 4 locations into a short report identifying the findings and next steps on this and some guidance to local jurisdictions and transit agencies. And that will be in the fall.
Hang on for a second, will you, Gil?
Oh, sure.
Mayor Erickson, please.
This data that you're gathering, I mean, what kind of data are you, I mean, one of the big concerns that a lot of jurisdictions has is meeting ADA requirements and the liability associated with not having those requirements in place. And I guess I'm a little nervous about, you know, we might be unzipping Pandora's box here. I'd like to know what data are you looking for?
I think that's kind of part of what we're going to be looking at, and I think part of our issue is there's just places where there's gaps in data. There's either no data or the data's been collected and is now it's a small jurisdiction, so a consultant has that data. So we were going to kind of look at the range of data, whether it be just presence of sidewalks or not, to whether or not there are curb ramps or those types of things, just as, again, kind of like just an opportunity to kind of look at the different methods and provide some guidance and assistance to local jurisdictions that might want to look at this in a more systematic manner themselves. So we realize that all the agencies are in the process of doing ADA transition plans and things like that, so that's kind of, but we're not intending to get in the way of that, but trying to help with the data collection and how to record that data in general.
Gil, is it fair to say that one of the objectives here would be to consolidate various data sets from a lot of different municipalities that may not exist in one key location and understand the data collection processes that those local jurisdictions might utilize so we can better have uniform data across the region?
That's correct. Yes, it's kind of that's a good way to say that. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Mayor Lucas.
I won't try to improve on it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Usually when work is done, there's money at the end of it. There's something that's doing, unless you're doing this just out of your benevolent heart to show these gaps and so forth. What is your thinking about, is this going to be another category that will be coming in for projects either countywide or regional wide for sidewalks and several things you mentioned before about bikes? What's the end game to this work that you're doing?
Sure. So the purpose of this is not to necessarily tie it to funding. We already have non-motorized set aside and we fund non-motorized programs, and we are funding gaps that agencies identify. Really the purpose of this started with simply we have a goal here at this body that we want to encourage non-motorized access to transit, for example, and these all ages and abilities. And right now, we're not able to do a lot of that analysis and identify those needs because of the lack of data. So it's really trying to, we recognize data collection across the board, whether it's this topic or another topic, is difficult to gather, and it's expensive. And so this was a way, and you can see the OpenStreetMap. I think that's kind of one of, we glossed over a little bit of the methodology, but finding a way that how can we be of assistance to our local agencies in gathering the data, making it consistent, and then being able to use that data as we move forward with our additional long-range planning and transit access tools so that we can really identify where are the needs, where are the gaps, and how is the system working.
Eskridge.
Yes, just want to mention and echo what Mayor Erickson said, in that data collection absent plan for action and remediation will have unintended consequences. So the warning is real, and absent a plan for remediation and monies behind it, certainly will elevate our knowledge and know where our gaps are, but it will have unintended consequences without remediation hooked to it.
And I guess maybe one thing just to add on is we will be looking at one of the examples here, that one of the local examples in action will be kind of the benefits of the type of data that's developed in data collection that show the ability to be able to show not just is a sidewalk present and somebody can get from A to B, but also the type of transportation needs that person has, whether it be a person with disability or a person with a cane, that type of a thing. So that will be something that we'll look at in one of the examples here. Are there any other questions? Oh.
Yes, please, Councilmember Zahn.
Well, I was going to mention that, I would say that for Bellevue, we appreciate data because we think that actually having consistent data that takes you across all modes is important for us to understand what's going on. So I understand that there may be some concern around, well, what are we doing with the data? Is there a consolidated plan? The fact that this is a pilot, to me, says that we are actually being deliberate about trying this out and getting an understanding. And that actually is the way that Bellevue has done business as well, is that we will try a project as a pilot just so we can learn and get some best practices. And so we look forward to learning about what this brings.
Councilmember Roberts next, and then we'll go around the horn to you, Councilmember.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I mean, I have a question about some work that you were talking about earlier. It may or may not involve sidewalks. So if this is not the right time, I'll ask the question, and then you can put it wherever you want. Many of us, if not all of us, read yesterday the Times report that came from the data coming out of WSDOT on safety and the high increase in accidents associated with bicycles and pedestrians and so on. I just think at some point, before we're much older, it would be helpful to get a little more detail on that information and look at it with an eye towards trying to see if we can incorporate that information in our plans, designs, and so on. So I just would like to put that question on the table. I appreciate that now is not the time that we'll have that information, but I think it would be useful to instruct and inform how we move forward in these models. Thanks.
Excellent point. I think 18 months ago or so, we have received a safety update, data update, and it was among the most sobering reports that we've received in this body in a long time. So opportunity for a refresh.
Yeah, and if I may, I think that's a really great point. And to address some of the other comments, we do have a plan. We have our active transportation plan. We have our transit access and parking strategy that talks about the need for these facilities, that talks about the need for improved safety and improved access. And I think one of our challenges with implementing those plans has been this lack of data. And again, I think the more data we have in terms of our conditions and the more data we can gather in terms of the statistics of usage and safety, that'll just help us, I think, move forward to implement some of those strategies. I think that's a great point.
Councilmember Cruller and then Board Member Trask.
Three things. On the ADA crossing time, we have Highway 99, which is Tequila International Boulevard. We've been asked by people who are wheelchair bound to slow down the amount of time to cross. And one of the things I learned along the journey was that not only can we adjust the times, but there are systems where there's two buttons, where there's the normal button that's big, and there's a lower button that's for ADA saying, I prefer a longer time to get across. So I thought that was innovative, and I would share that. Maybe you already know about all those things. On buses, I'm starting to bike twice a week. Maybe it'll turn into 3 times a week, so I'm painfully aware of what works well and what doesn't. I don't know what the answer is, but the bike racks only hold 3. If you want to jump on transit at some point, you don't feel safe, or you're not making your meeting, or your knees are killing you, whatever it is. Are there any breakthroughs in technology? 3 bike riders per bus, especially a double bendy bus, that amazes me. Yet I can take my bike literally on a light rail train. So it's just food for thought. I don't have any answers. I just know it's a barrier. When you collect your data, I'd love it if you'd talk about bike route issue information from cyclers. There's certain points in time where in 2 levels, information. There are people who believe we can't be on sidewalks, and there are people who believe that we can be both on street and sidewalks. So we need to get better information out there on that. When you're on the sidewalk, I'm starting to discover painfully some sidewalks are in great repair and some are not. And that's difficult on your bike and flattens tires and causes people to crash and things. So there's that, but when you're on marginal way and the traffic's going really, really fast, it is the safest place for us to be once the path ends right in the middle of marginal way. So we need a little help there. And then I would also ask that you get data from cyclers on routes that we'd like to go on, but they stop. And my favorite one to mention is Airport Way, because Tequila's got all the bike route stuff right to and around to the Airport Way on the east side, and it stops because it becomes Seattle, and there's really no safe way to be on Airport Way. And I find that fascinating because you can see old paths there that need repair that could easily be transmitted into walking and biking paths, and that would be probably one of the fastest routes north-south out of Seattle. Food for thought. Money, of course, not abundant, but I just thought I'd share those thoughts.
Good suggestions, Councilmember Cruller, and though I don't have answers to all your questions, I would recommend you have a sidebar conversation with Councilmember Ryan in Community Transit. They've got a couple of vehicle maintenance engineers that redesign a couple of insides of their buses to allow for not only bike racks on the front, but a couple of bike riders to get inside too. So there's some interesting innovation that have happened, and I think that they even those guys patented it for you, I think, that decision too. So maybe a moneymaker there for you, Councilmember Ryan. Board Member Trask.
It should come as no surprise. This is a wonderful conversation, and I'm really excited about it. And thanks so much for PSRC for leading this coordination. And as a part of that, I'm really hearing, in order to facilitate the coordination and kind of connect the dots, how does this relate to funding? In particular, Kelly, you mentioned that there's non-motorized funding sources, but my understanding is there are a lot of the FTA sources as well should be eligible for this. And how does PSRC better, facilitate and coordinate that conversation and pave the way so that jurisdictions and transit agencies know and realize that there are these multiple funding sources, so we have a larger array of funding rather than just the set-aside or just TAP or what have you?
Sure. No, I think that's a great question, and I think they're all pretty well aware, and you'll see when you see the projects next month, our criteria really draws on, and even with our transit criteria, it talks about multimodal accessibility. So you'll see many projects that are including those additional bicycle and pedestrian elements above and beyond the set-aside. So it's woven into our criteria. So I think we're doing a good job there, but there's also other funding sources out there, and I know the Active Transportation Plan, I believe, highlights some of those additional funding sources like safe routes to schools and other sources.
Councilmember Durr.
Thank you. So this isn't directly related to sidewalk data, but since we're talking about bike access, I'm curious if in the Active Transportation Plan there's any discussion about a secured bike lockups at park and rides, because I think that's a barrier for people to leave their bikes behind, and if there isn't a spot on the bus, I know I would ride the bus more if I could get my bike just to the park and ride and felt like it wouldn't be gone when I came back.
I think that's both part of our active transportation plans, access to transit, as well as the transit access strategy we talked about as well, bicycle parking and access, bicycle access to transit is on in both of those areas. So those are some key points as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll mention that I noticed our friends at Sound Transit writing a lot of notes, Councilmember Durr, while you were talking, so don't be surprised by a follow-up. Gil, shall we bring up our guest speakers and transition into those discussions?
At this point, I'd like to introduce, we have two presentations, one from Pierce Transit and one from the UW Taskar Center for Accessible Technology. So first, I'd like to invite Tim Renfro, the ADA Eligibility Administrator at Pierce Transit, to come forward and give his presentation.
All right. Good morning. Everybody hear me okay? Okay. In my role as eligibility administrator with Pierce Transit, I oversee eligibility for our ADA paratransit. We call it shuttle. Up here, you call your service access here in King County. I also oversee our travel train department, and I'm a member of the Special Needs Transportation Committee here at PSRC. I represent Pierce Transit in local and regional coordinated transportation functions. So that's kind of my role. We had applied for a grant to assist with accessible trip planning, and I want to, hopefully this is, which one? Is this one right here? Okay, very good. All right. So, to give you a little bit of background, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, as a transit provider, our primary function is to integrate services for people with disabilities. So to the highest degree possible, that means we try and provide service for those folks on the bus system, the, trains, that sort of thing. And in that scenario, paratransit service is seen really as a safety net, only for those people with disabilities that prevent their use of the regular fixed route system. So the ADA, of course, did a lot of things in terms of accessibility and requirements, but one of the things I really think is brilliant was a recognition that there are many people with disabilities who can use the bus system when they can get to it. So for those people, there's what's called conditional eligibility. So conditional eligibility isn't for everyone. It's about 20% of our customers, about 1,000 people qualify. For those folks, what we actually do is we assess each trip that they take based on their needs and make a decision about whether it's a bus trip, a paratransit trip, or a combination trip. I guess the lingo grows nowadays as a last mile, first mile, last mile service. In the paratransit world, we have an accessible first mile, last mile service. We call it feeder service. So I may not be able to get to the bus from my home, but I can get feeder service to a transit center, then catch the bus or the train and go on to my destination. So, of course, we put in a lot of work in terms of assessing people. We have physical therapists and such under contract that we work when we assess people and do the best we can to be very safe in identifying what each person's particular limit is in terms of independent travel. So what we see is really a diverse amount of needs. For many people, probably the simplest is distance. Obviously, distance is pretty easy to assess. We have all sorts of online trip planners and such that will do distance. But as you'll see, there's a number of other things we have to look at, and some of them you folks were discussing a little bit earlier. So basically, a person establishes their conditional eligibility. They call for a trip. If there's a trip plan that our customer service staff has, they'll put that in. It may be bus, it may be the feeder service, which I spoke of, or it may be a full paratransit trip, depending upon what the need is. So certainly accessibility is part of the deal and our responsibility for integration. But for those of you who are familiar with public transit, you also know that paratransit service costs a whole lot more to provide than bus service. So for us, during the 2-year time period that we had our grant, our paratransit service cost roughly about $57 a one-way trip. And our fixed route system costs about 1/8 that amount, give or take a little. So just as a comparison. So our objective was to take a look at the places that our paratransit customers travel to and create an accessibility inventory of those destinations. So a little bit more about the kinds of things we look at. As you see, the gentleman with the purple shirt on is in a manual chair, and there's no curb cut where he's looking to go. So this is a pretty obvious one. What we have to look at then is there an alternative pathway that is accessible that would allow him to get to his destination? The lady down below is standing next to a brick wall. As you can see, that's a very, very narrow kind of pathway there. So obviously anybody with a manual chair, a walker, four-wheeled walker, power chair, they're going to be prevented from using that pathway for travel. So we'd have to look to an alternative. So the middle picture shows some more obstructions in the sidewalk, and then down below in the middle is you see a Pierce Transit bus, and it's a little hard to see maybe from the picture, but it is actually going down hill there. Now, in terms of cities and accessibility and the kinds of features they look at if the curb is paved and smooth and the road and the sidewalk have parallel within about 2% or so, it meets accessibility standards. But from our perspective, the fact that something meets accessibility standards doesn't mean that we have no paratransit responsibility. Obviously, if a person like the gentleman in the manual chair or a person with very limited physical tolerance is unable to walk up that hill, then that triggers the requirement for us to provide paratransit service of some distinction in that process. So those are some of the considerations. We looked at a lot of other different things too, like the speed of traffic, in particular if it's a 4-lane unsignaled area and some of those other things. So during our project, what we did was we had a staff member who luckily was familiar with doing this kind of work who wanted to step up and take charge of this project. And so we ended up putting her in that position and then hiring someone to take care of her other duties. So during our 2-year grant, we looked at path of travel reviews for 3,352 locations. Now, here's another distinction between some of your conversation earlier and what we're doing here. Obviously, cities, municipalities, the concern is with the public right-of-way and what happens in those areas. But for our needs, we actually have to see if the person can make it to the location, which means in some cases we're into private property that we actually have to assess, or the Walmart parking lot or the mall parking lot, okay? So those are some of the things that make it a little bit different than the kinds of information that's commonly gathered. So we created our accessibility inventory, and we also worked with the municipalities on creating an accessibility map. Now, I really appreciate the comments that a couple of you made earlier about, and we found it to be true. When we are approaching some of the municipalities about, can we get a shape file of your area showing us where the curb cuts are and all that, there was a little bit of consternation about that, and we can certainly see how, people don't like to advertise maybe where their deficiencies are. We know it's a very touchy area. But we did gather some of that information, and during the time period, we completed 4,330 trip plans, and a trip plan meaning customer requested, I want to go somewhere, 4,300 different plans over that 2-year time period. From that, we found that 41% of the time, we could come up with a bus, a fixed route solution only. 33% of the time, we came up with the feeder service or last mile service, which I mentioned earlier. So over 70% of the time, we are able to reduce the use of paratransit services. So the other thing that we were able to accomplish during the project was it reduced our time for completing site reviews. Prior to that, it would take us a week or longer, but having a designated person allowed us to be able to review that plan same day or within 24 hours. So that was extremely valuable. One of the things, too, we did was we wanted to really look at the concept of automating this trip planning process. As we're all aware, there are trip planning apps or whatever out there that are going to get you from a boat to a bus or from a bus to a train, that sort of thing. But in terms of looking at accessibility features and making a decision about the type of service you need, there really isn't any. Well, actually, there is one. The company we work with has a very fledgling intermodal trip planner, and we approached them and asked about the concept of working together to expand it, but they weren't interested. So we also took a look at our fixed route trip planner and thought this would be a great place to have this data or link this data. But at this time, that's not a feasible possibility either. So anyhow, one of the neat things about a project is you get to kind of reach out and meet some different people in your community and do some different things. So the University of Washington, Tacoma, and City of Tacoma co-sponsored with us our first ever hackathon. Those of you, everyone familiar with that term? Those of you unfamiliar with that term, it's a group of IT students that are given a problem. And the problem was pretty similar to if you're a person with a disability and limitations, how do you know if you can use the bus for your trip? And so we put them loose and saw what they could come up with for solutions. So it was a very interesting experience. We also took part in another experience, too, provided by, I think, our next presenters, as well as PSRC. They may be talking about that. We had a number of jurisdictions provide us accessibility mapping data. And I want to give special kudos to Pierce County. I heard there was a representative here from there. Their Public Works Department was exceptionally helpful. And so we ended up working with a company called Geoengineers and Esri. We purchased an app to help us kind of automate the process of our trip assessments during the course of this. So our person can walk out there with a tablet and hit start and walk a certain area and hit end, and it marks the path and distance and does some of those things. And for the other items that we need for assessing, we can add those in ourselves too. We also made the rounds to some disability organizations. There were 4 organizations that invited us out to talk about our project, and then we also had our Citizens Transportation Advisory Group that we did a presentation for. And you notice it's in big letters. Really want to say thank you to PSRC, and I also want to add to the region. We're all partners in terms of how we determine these grants and what goes forward. So wanted to make sure Pierce Transit put that out there. Now, I'm almost done, but just wanted to give you one little visual. So now, this is something that didn't exist before. We used to have like 4 different databases we'd have to go in, a trip planner here, Google Trips here, and but now it's all kind of consolidated. So we have a destination, as you see it circled in blue, and if you were to go down, there's about 20 different fields where you can see the distance from the stops, and if you were to go down further, you'd know if there was 4-lane unsignaled crossing or not. You'd know if there was any rough terrain, unpaved areas, and a variety of other things you'd know. And there's a little orange dot there. If you clicked on that, that's a barrier right there. And so it would explain what that is and give the picture. So this is something, too, that we wouldn't have had if we hadn't been able to do this project. So thank you.
Mr. Renfro, thank you for that. I know that traditionally we would sort of, at this point, tease you out and bring other folks in, but I think it'd be valuable for you to stay at the table just in case during the second presentation additional questions come up that might be relevant for you. And for Mr. Hamashima, you take that compliment when you can get it about, the good work of Pierce County. As an elected official, I can count on probably one hand the number of compliments that I've gotten, at least in the last week or so. So that was well-deserved and well-earned, Mr. Hamashima. Gil, you want to introduce our next
So at this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Annette Caspi and Nick Bolton, a PhD candidate for the UW Taskar Center for Accessible Technology, to come up here and introduce an innovation called Access Map. And with this, I'll let them take it away.
Hello. Thank you. Hi, my name is Anat Caspi. I'm the director of the Taskar Center for Accessible Technology at the University of Washington, which is part of the Paula G. Allen School for Computer Science. With me here is Nick Bolton, an electrical engineering student. And today we were invited to present our product Access Map, which is somewhat of an answer to Tim's request for an automated version of that kind of accessible planning. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that we really are looking at a much bigger paradigm change for pedestrian smart cities, which actually really requires a data collaborative approach in order to address the needs of all the multiple stakeholders that we're considering here when talking about accessible planning, and in particular talking about pedestrian focused data. So pedestrian smart, what does that mean? People talk about smart cities. In the most recent applications for the Smart City Challenge, which Seattle actually vied for and did not make the cut, that was a $50 million injection into smart cities, and 80% of those applications mentioned advancing non-motorized mobility as a pertinent part of building smart cities. And what that means is that we really need to focus on enhancing non-motorized mobility options, as in walking and cycling options, in order to offer the following 3 things. First, sustainability. We're really interested in sustainability. Equitable access to transportation. And lastly, a real human-focused and human-scale neighborhoods that could encourage people to follow their daily paths in a non-motorized way. So when I want to do my business in a neighborhood, I need that neighborhood to be in a human scale and approachable for me. And the kinds of data collection that we're promoting is really pedestrian focused. It's really about changing the focus from what an automobile needs to traverse the environment, which is a width of, a standard car sized, to what are the pedestrian needs across the terrain. One of the sort of taglines we promote is Google, we're not just slow-moving cars. And Google treats us like slow-moving cars. When you opt for pedestrian directions on Google, you basically are receiving a path that designates what road you ought to take in the shortest path kind of way. But we know that pedestrians have multiple other needs. It's not just about special needs travelers. This is my access point to this kind of project, but everybody approaches the environment in different ways and has different needs. You know, we're not even starting to talk about the collection of data around pollen counts that would address my allergy needs and noise information and crowdedness and things like that. At this point, we're really just focused about collecting the absolute information gaps that exist for special needs travelers. But you can see how investing in the foundation and a fundamental network that really focuses on the underlying pedestrian transportation network could really enhance our ability to look at the needs of special needs travelers and beyond, and promote pedestrianism and cycling in ways that we haven't been able to before. And so the point is, in engaging participatory design aspects in the way that we've designed both the data standards that we're promoting and then some of the endpoints, which Access Map is one. So endpoint meaning how do we consume this data in a way and show it to people in ways that are accessible to them, as opposed to just a listing of, what's along the sidewalk, things like that. How do I make conscious decisions about how I traverse the environment and have the confidence that what I see, the path that's drawn out to me, is really traversable to me, given the customizations and personalized mobility options that I've selected. So again, we're human-centric. We work with participatory design principles and work with the community. We have several communities of practice that have informed and engaged with us, including PSRC, and we're very thankful for that. And the questions we ask are, how do human factors really impact the actions and decisions that people make as they navigate the urban environment? And when we're serving pedestrians, but the end point will not just serve pedestrians. So the previous slide was talking about what are all the other multiple stakeholders, and we talked about the ADA compliance system as one. Businesses ask us all the time, will you map us the path along the sidewalks that will engage this particular kind of population? We're asked by emergency responders. They need to have information on the ground before they arrive at a scene. And, for me personally, I push a wheelchair a significant portion of my day. And when I came to Seattle, there was no way to access this kind of information. I need to go to 4 different endpoints and hope that Google Street View went past here in the last 4 years before all the changes in construction took place, so that I can assess whether I can push my daughter through a particular neighborhood. And that's a significant use case for many, many people in this region, and it's only growing. So in serving pedestrians, we begin with human-centric factors. We're looking at what is the infrastructure on the ground. And this is not just a tag-on onto the automobile network. We need information about the underlying transportation layer that supports pedestrians and cyclists. And in addition to that, we need a collaborative map. We need the ability to integrate the information, as you have noted, from different agencies and municipalities, and do it in a way that's conscious of their concerns. So we have a data collaborative in order to have the open shared portions of the data enable the sharing part and the standardization and consistency that Gil was referring to, but we also have these mechanisms to allow for data provenance so that agencies that are concerned about not exposing their ADA compliant quarter-inch displacement data set that is overlaid on top of that is not necessarily exposed. And so I think this is something that ought to be considered, right? That agencies have their particular boundaries in terms of what they are willing to share, but the underlying data layer itself ought to be shared, because we're constantly changing that environment, and there's nothing that's necessarily litigious about it. And so we've developed, as we develop a smart city initiative that creates data to serve pedestrians and other transit needs, we really need that unifying layer for ability to compare. And then ability to also, once we have this data, we're able to produce things like real access scores, not these like totally relevant to business only access scores. Accessibility assessments, like for the ADA compliance system, and also the ability to really understand how infrastructure changes ought to be prioritized, because certain things provide bottlenecks between two entire neighborhoods, and other curb cuts might improve the sustainability of a particular block, but are not as well traversed as others. And so having this kind of fundamental infrastructure is a prerequisite to making smart infrastructure decisions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nick, who will talk specifically about our tool access map.
Before you do, Dr. Caspi, let me just pause for a quick second and ask a question, because that was a lot of information, presented very well, but a lot of information.
I had to talk fast.
One of the things that I thought I heard was that you're developing what is effectively a more comprehensive layer for pedestrian access, but that there was an element about it that might allow for individual customization. And let me use myself as an example. I'm a pretty able-bodied individual and would happily walk along a steeper grade of a street like First Avenue if I have a much more interesting and engaging pedestrian environment than what might be a easier street to walk on, Second Avenue, but maybe less interesting visually. Is it my understanding that what you're developing here is individually customizable to allow me to say, like, I'm okay walking a little bit steeper of a hill if I've got more cool stuff to look at?
So yes, the answer is yes. It's that kind of pedestrian delight feature has actually been, we've talked a lot to local architecture agencies who are very much interested in that kind of approach to pedestrianism. And this would be sort of our next step once we're able to offer these kinds of features, right? So you could opt for interesting architecture, and it would guide you through streets that would presumably offer you that. Or like the more scenic route, or just avoid spruce trees because I don't want to walk alongside spruce trees. Those kinds of features are specifically only available when we have the underlying pedestrian network fully mapped out. And I argue in the way that connectivity allows you to really understand how routing would be done through that urban space.
Hopefully the app would also remind you, if you chose that architecture feature, to stop looking at your phone and look up at the buildings too. But,
one would hope.
Yeah. Board Member Trask, please.
Just somewhat following up on that in a kind of related way, we've had an interesting conversation about $12 million bike lanes and the conversation around, well, what exactly went in that $12 million? And in fact, the majority of that was actually for motor vehicles. And so I think there's this interesting conversation of the nexus between what is pedestrian infrastructure and what is actually infrastructure that's mitigating for motor vehicles in that setting. And part of that, I guess, that interplay is I'm really curious if you're examining motor vehicle infrastructure adjacent to pedestrian spaces and its impact, whether that's motor vehicle speeds or otherwise, because if you have a slower street, you need less armoring for pedestrians and vice versa. And so what's that interplay in this conversation and in your analysis to better say, do we actually need these investments if we're actually willing to make a trade-off to say we want a more human-scaled right-of-way?
I think the best way to answer that is let Nick actually demonstrate his work. So I appreciate the question. Thank you.
Go ahead and press that mic. I can steal it. Yeah. Cool. All right. Hello, everybody. So my part's going to be even more dense, and I'm going to go fast, so apologies. So I'm going to be talking about the effective portion of our talk. And so what I'm going to be focused on is direct and immediate needs and how they can be addressed by getting this kind of data. Just to jump in really quick. So here's a typical example from a wheelchair user who we've talked to. So they'll say things like, using a tool like directions on Google Maps doesn't really help me get around. Sometimes it does more harm than good. I'm sent down streets I can't cross or up inclines that are impossible to climb. It can be deeply frustrating. So this is an informational gap that is almost always missing, and we've heard that repeated by several different people today. And I'm going to show an example of what that looks like. So I'm picking on Google a little bit here, but Google is one of the best. Every other service that tries to provide routes for pedestrians does the same kind of thing. So let's point out what happens if we're trying to get from somewhere near Western, kind of in the vicinity of Pike Place Market. We want to get to Seattle City Hall. We're offered 3 routes. Every single one has a very serious problem for someone in a manual wheelchair. It either has extremely steep hills, something above ADA requirements, and that's for an entire block as opposed to a single ramp. This one has several stairs and actually tries to put you down Post Alley. And there's frequently construction, or has been construction along Western Avenue that you would encounter if you tried to follow the route provided by Google. And so why isn't this happening? This is because all of our maps were designed for streets. They were supplemented by governmental funding in the Tiger program to collect all that street data. And since then, we based everything on the street network. That leaves behind a huge number of pedestrians. Something like 20% of pedestrians simply cannot effectively use these mapping applications. So what would it look like if we did want to actually effectively use mapping in order to address pedestrian needs? We would need to treat it just like we treat the street network. We need to know where you can go. We need to know what you encounter as you attempt to travel on pedestrian infrastructure. So this is a quick example where we're showing lines that connect where you can go, same as the street network. And we're accounting for a lot of information similar to what Tim was describing with his pictures. Like, you remember that man with the purple shirt in the manual wheelchair running into a curb situation. Well, we could describe that right here. We can say if you travel along this path right here, and you were to directly travel to your curb, to the crosswalk, you would encounter a raised curb. However, if this situation actually does have a curb ramp, and we've described that path as well. And that's important because there may be a massive pothole here or a potentially slippery surface. But if we map the actual path someone will take, we can start to describe what does it mean when you actually try to traverse this area. So I'm going to do a quick demo of Access Map, which attempts to answer those kinds of questions using that data model. So this is the staging version of Access Map. It's a web map similar to Google Maps. If you've explored with maps before, you can zoom in, you can explore your data. Here we're showing sidewalks in the city of Seattle. You can click on one to get kind of an overview of what you're looking at. This is near 3rd Avenue. The maximum expected incline is 1.2%, has concrete surface, it's this wide. We've also got information about crossings, what it means to cross the street. Does it have curb ramps? Is it a marked crossing so you can feel more safe? And most importantly, this information is all tied together in a network, which is extremely valuable information because then you can do automated large-scale analysis as well as automatic trip planning. All the things you can do with streets and all the magic you can do with street mapping, now you can do with pedestrians. So as an example, we can pick a very similar route. We can say, okay, I want to go from here, and I want to go somewhere up here higher in Seattle. We could have also searched for those locations using these search boxes. And we're given a very different trip than Google Maps or any other service would give. First of all, we can see there's a lack of red lines in the middle of this path. Red lines indicate extremely steep areas that would not be accessible for someone in a manual wheelchair. In addition, we can see we can cut through buildings in various spots. And that's because we know about building elevators. And that is what an actual individual who regularly goes downtown would do. They would keep track in their mind areas where buildings are open. They know when they're open. They know where the elevators are. And that's how they traverse downtown Seattle. That's the kind of information that is difficult to automatically acquire for an individual without a mapping tool like this and without having this kind of information. In addition, we can get information about these different paths. We know when they're open. And this information right here is relatively easy to collect. I actually manually added the elevator paths myself using OpenStreetMap and then joined them to our data. So Access Map is live. It's used by a ton of people every month. We've got over 20,000 people using it in roughly a year or so. And that's with the version that isn't even quite as cool as this one. So another thing to emphasize is this is personally customized routes. We've got 4 different settings you can mess with here. You can say, I don't actually require curb ramps. You'll get a slightly different route. You can say, I'm actually fine with less steep hills. You'll often get a slightly different route. You can say, I absolutely cannot do extremely steep areas. This one actually happens to continue to keep working, and that's because it's using all those elevator paths. But if we bumped it up really, really high, we'd suddenly start getting very different routes. And so, I'm going to skip to the next part. So that's showing a direct use. So that was the question that you just can't ask. You can't get automatic routes downtown unless you have a tool like that. Let's flip that on its head and talk about analysis and knowing efficacy. What are the areas where pedestrians can get to? And what is the full diversity of pedestrian needs and how well are they served? So right here I'm showing an example of a 400-meter walk shed or a quarter-mile walk shed. This should be really familiar to anybody who does transit analysis stuff. This is like first, last mile type of question, where you say, if I'm at this location, in this case, this black dot right in the middle, where can I get if I can walk or roll 400 meters? So in dark black, I'm showing the street network. This is where you can get if you can go 400 meters, and all we know is that there's a street network and maybe you can walk on streets. And in light gray is the pedestrian network. This is where you can get if you're a pedestrian. And the thing that I want to point out is that those don't agree. So you can't actually directly answer the question, where can a pedestrian safely get, without knowing the exact pedestrian network. But the black line represents the state of the art for the vast majority of transit agencies. So there's a simple question, where can you get as a pedestrian, and you cannot answer it without this information. In addition, we can suddenly start asking constrained questions. So magenta here is showing where can you get on the pedestrian network if you cannot do very steep areas. Suddenly whole areas are now blocked off for that pedestrian. Or where can you get if you require curb ramps to traverse pedestrian infrastructure? A much smaller area now. Or finally, what if you strongly prefer crosswalks for busy roads? And even smaller areas there. These are questions that you cannot ask without specific pedestrian information, and so you cannot evaluate how well you're serving your constituents. In addition, we can do this extremely scalably. That's the value of storing this as data. We can ask this question about the entire city of Seattle, the entire region, as long as we have that data. So in this case, I mapped all that information just into one line, where color means effectively what is the relative pedestrian accessibility under those constraints versus the street grid. Is it as good as if you only knew about streets, or is it much worse than if you knew about streets? And it's a little bit washed out, but you can see strong variations and also correlations in color, showing places where it's very steep, for example. Those would be the green areas. Or areas that are pink, for example, would lack curb ramps and they lack crosswalks, but they're relatively flat. And you can see quite a few in residential areas, for example, North Ballard. Finally, let's look at a much simpler graph, or a simpler plot. We just want to know, hey, how walkable is this area? How easy is it to get around? How easily can I get to amenities? And I'm going to compare to Walk Score, which doesn't actually know about sidewalks, and usually tries to evaluate points of interest, like how easy is it to get to a grocery store if you can walk on a street. And the thing I want to point out is that focusing on that street network and amenities leaves out a lot of information. We can see there's a lot of disagreement between our evaluation, which is these lines drawn on top of the grid. So all these red lines mean you basically can't get around if you want to use sidewalks. And the underlying base map is showing green. It's saying, hey, this is a great area to walk around and you can easily get to your amenities. And so this is again due to a lack of information. By assuming that the street grid was good enough, we've reached very, very incorrect conclusions about how well served this area is by pedestrian infrastructure. And then next I'm going to talk quickly about efficiency of data collection, how we can actually do this and what we've done before. So that's the open sidewalks model. The simple overview of it is we use an extremely flexible data model and one that is extremely connected. So that means we can draw the infrastructure where people can actually go. So we can draw sidewalks, we can draw crossings. In addition, we can recognize potential barriers or other infrastructure and annotate that grid with them. And for that, we use OpenStreetMap, and we have this extensible data model where you can describe basically as much as you want and build on that over time to get more and more specific and more related information that is inherently networked, which makes it very easy to ask the complex questions you need to when evaluating pedestrian accessibility. Second, that data model is a global database. That means everybody knows where to look to get the data. Everyone knows where to go to contribute new data. And when it comes to maintenance, that's a big boon. You know exactly where to go if you want to add new information, and the community can actually suggest changes based on their real experience on the ground. And finally, it's scalable. You can actually do it. So a group in San Jose self-mapped their entire city using our standard, using our tools, and our data description in OpenStreetMap. It took 4 people in their spare time in just a couple of months. So this is just individuals mapping out an entire city on their own extremely cheaply and with very high efficacy. And this is directly tied to their transit systems. Cool. All right. So I just want to say thank you and ready for questions.
People seem a little tongue-tied. Anybody want to start? Oh, please, Councilmember Cruller.
So I want to know, I'm a Wazer, and I love it. And if you get this to be more like social media, you can map even faster. Wondering if you're going in that direction or already have.
Yes, we're going directly in that direction because of how much information that's important, but maybe not have been collected by municipalities. we're working directly on that because it's going to be extremely important that when you're actually trying to use a route, you can say, hey, I actually ran into this unexpected barrier. Some jerk parks their truck in front of the sidewalk, or there's a sandwich board that I just can't deal with. And that's an opportunity to also collect live data and say, hey, this thing is here, and we want to avoid it. Yeah.
Please, Councilmember Zahn.
I'm fascinated by this because to me, what I'm seeing is that we're really talking about livability, right? That we are talking about folks that are challenged by lack of sidewalks and whatnot, but it really goes to the access for everyone. And I can also see the cross connection between land use and transportation, right? So when you talk about the ability of people to actually navigate steep inclines through buildings, there is a part of me that gets a little jolt because I started thinking about whether these building owners are kind of like ways where we start going into individual neighborhoods and those neighborhoods get kind of upset about all these cars suddenly showing up. So as I think about how holistically we think of a transportation network, it is one I hadn't thought about. So this whole idea of how do we cross-connect to leverage what we need to do. So I'm wondering about that part of it. If you could comment about the building tied into this.
Sure. So if I understand it right, one of the points I would make is that by using this particular form of infrastructure, using OpenStreetMap, everything is tied together by default there. It's all in the same place. So when you want to ask a question of, hey, I'm using this sidewalk, now tell me what's the busy street nearby, that's an extremely easy question to ask because it's just right there. You can even ask it using simple network questions that would not be available using like a shapefile, for example. And everything is there. So, buildings, points of interest, hospitals, often green spaces, that's all kind of together at once. And that connectivity is much more valuable than having those things separate.
And just to add to respond to your question, likewise, we can request routes that avoid being street side to streets that have, 45 mile per hour speed limits as opposed to just residential speed limits, for example.
Right, and OpenStreetMap was also meant for cars initially, and so it has lots of really good information about a given street. You can annotate the lanes, you can annotate the speed limit, the estimated congestion. That's information that is generally there for all of the busier streets.
And then the other question I have is, so in the city of Bellevue, we actually do have a number of video cameras that collect data and do quite a bit with video analytics. So does this actually collect many different sources of data to understand what's going on, or?
The way I would put it is that this is kind of the pedestrian network layer that you could use to understand many different data sources. So if you were collecting data using videos or imagery, which we do frequently, this would be like the landing ground for the interpreted data that says, hey, this is what the network looks like right now. But we use many different data sources, and they all integrate at this one place very effectively.
And you said that's global, which means that anyone that wants to give you data, it goes to a single point source so that it anything that gets updated, it pushes out to the map?
Yeah. For example, San Jose, they did all that self-mapping. That was on this global database. They did it all themselves. They knew exactly where to look. And I can go look at their data right now if I want and make comments and all that.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing how that works. Thanks.
Board Member Eskridge.
Yes, I can't believe how wonderful and valuable this is, and to see it from our colleagues at the University of Washington. We're rising out of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit that we lost associated with ADA. It's been in the paper, so it's not speaking out of class. In terms of talking about that, we were found responsible for not having program access appropriately associated with site arrival with our parking lots. And they're headed to all of our sidewalks and buildings and access to amenities. So if you mapped that town in 4 days, we need it yesterday because we believe in terms of as a small municipality, in terms of how we look at ourselves as a mid-sized city, in the middle of Seattle in an urban environment, we're enormously at risk associated with this. Our access mapping is in the 80s. Associated with what we have currently on campus, and we're investing in the GIS integrated system piece. So we hope to partner with you relative to what we can do. But I can't recommend this to cities at the table relative to what we've experienced, both in terms of financial harm, in terms of what really is important to address in access issues. There are many gaps, there are many pieces that are missing, and how do you really want to spend your money in terms of remediation? There are thousands of things that need it. So I'm glad that PSRC has supported this activity.
Mayor Lucas.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm a little interested in the San Jose example and how this worked. What I'm used to is with college summer hires, we went around with a GPS and we did fire hydrants, light poles, did everything. So we had our layer of our maps. And it was fairly simple, but you were walking around doing much more probably than what this is intended to do. What would be a couple of the techniques they used to do this so quickly and on their own time? Did they drive around? Did they use drones to do what? How did they do it?
So they have multiple sources of data. So they can use imagery that had been previously collected, as well as on-the-ground surveys, similar to like if you have interns going out and collecting data using GPS devices. And essentially, once they have some of that information, they just go home and they add it with their computers directly using what is the most common way to add data to OpenStreetMap, which is you just click and you draw where those features are. Our tooling helps support that quite a bit by pre-seeding every area that might have a sidewalk with a suggested sidewalk line. And then the task just becomes deleting things, saying, no, there actually wasn't a sidewalk there. Now I'm going to submit this change. And so just by having slightly better tooling that knows what kind of data that you're trying to create, you can support a much more efficient process. So I'm very familiar with those processes where interns go out and they use GPS devices to collect things, and just in a really hand-wavy way that is, of course, a bit biased. In my experience, the OpenStreetMap mapping strategy that literally just comes down to describing shapes and drawing them has been probably more accurate than my experience in terms of the data than my experience with some of these city or municipality-led operations with these kind of clunky GPS devices. So I don't want to be too mean, but looking at that recent SDOT survey of sidewalks that was a result of those of getting sued, looking at the top 100 or so impacted sidewalks with their displacement, saying these are areas that someone with a wheelchair probably couldn't get through because there's a giant crack in the sidewalk, for example. I would say the vast majority of them were incorrect. So it's just this tricky thing where, that's the standard that I compare to, I guess, is I can't use that data, and I can use the OpenStreetMap data.
Thank you for the further information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Board Member Messer and then Mayor Erickson.
I have two questions, and I might have missed this because it was a lot of information, but how does the tool consider low-stress streets that may not have sidewalks?
So in the OpenStreetMap standard, there are ways of designating primary, secondary, tertiary roads, and so the sidewalks associated with those would then be preferentially selected based on people's preferences.
Yeah, so I'd say there's two parts. One, Access Map doesn't do very much with roads right now, so the thing I showed you doesn't do that. But the data model that we're basing it on, which is OpenStreetMap, is inherently connected to that street network. So if you have one of those, like residential class roads, for example, with low traffic, that's going to be directly connected to crosswalks, for example. And so a pedestrian routing solution will automatically be able to go and pop over to the road network for less busy streets.
Great, thanks, because I think it's a really important part to consider as we're building out pedestrian networks and directing people where to go, especially considering costs and limitations with funding and whatnot. My second question is about the potential for including data that would be different during the day versus the night, like street light information. I'm just thinking about safety, and a lot of places I want to walk during the day, I don't want to walk during the night.
So our data right now allows for that kind of transiency. So in the instance of elevators, for example, something that we didn't demonstrate here today, but you can actually select the time of day in which you're trying to traverse the environment, and that would have changed those options. It would have invalidated the elevator paths, and likewise we can do the same with lighting as a preference. So if you want to show that, I think you have to scroll it down.
Oh, is that what it is? It may have been disabled
I see.
for this demo.
Got it. Yeah, so that's actually one thing that's important to note about OpenStreetMap. It doesn't quite allow for transient data sources to be incorporated, and one of the next steps for us is to incorporate rain information, humidity, lighting, noise, crowdedness, things that are temporally related, and therefore would have to be in a separate global database that's not supported by this infrastructure.
Cool. So I did find it. So new route doesn't know about elevators because we've said it's 10 p.m., for example.
Mayor Erickson, please.
Just real quickly, as a person that's going to have to figure out how to pay for fixing sidewalks, have you overlaid any of this data with safety information? For instance, if you have, really obviously challenged pedestrian pathways and you see pedestrian strikes, have you overlaid that data?
So we tried to use the Seattle DOT sidewalk issues data set, and as Nick described, it was not reliable enough for us to use. We're also a little leery of irritating folks like you about actually publicizing this kind of data in a global kind of way. So this is maybe a good opportunity for us to discuss good ways to inform the public about these things without being concerned about litigious actions and things like that.
It's also a hard analysis to do, again, because we don't have this really basic infrastructure for where are the pedestrian paths. So when that data is reported, it's reported as like an intersection and maybe roughly a cardinal direction, but not actually saying, here's the exact corner, this person was crossing this crosswalk, that's where they got hit. And that adds a challenge to systematically using that data.
I'm asking the question because if we had that kind of correlation, we as local jurisdictions would have the ability to fix places that have repetitive, situations with pedestrian safety. That's the real key, is to fix it before you do get into trouble with something. So that's why I'm asking.
Yeah,
So I think the point is that if the foundation is laying and you have this kind of layer, you're able to do those kinds of analyses ongoing.
And it's one of those things where you don't necessarily know in advance what the cause is, and having as much information as possible to see, what really predicts safety at this location. Well, if we don't have any information, we can't. All we can do is make guesses. So, yeah.
Mr. Hammerschmidt. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I find this presentation very heartening at a variety of levels. Is that certainly we've talked about coordinated transportation with Gil, but more so in a programmatic fashion, whatever that word means, and I think it was more in terms of money and actual plans. But here we're talking about the application of how we accommodate a wider array of our community, and in terms of transportation. And it's amazing how long this issue has been around, since the 1980s, I guess, with Section 504, with what was called UMTA back then, is that they said that you had to accommodate the transportation disadvantaged. I believe that was a term that was used in all the cities and anywhere you were at that point in time. And so here it's evolved, where we're talking about how do you accommodate people at the ground level. So, and I admit I've been remiss in terms of developing our transportation plan in terms of, we have certainly non-motorized bicycles, but we don't really look at things like wheelchairs at this juncture. But we are required, certainly by law, by ADA, in terms of our transition plans. We need to map those things out. At the same time, here's the other side of the coin, is that, and kind of Eskridge reminds us of the liability issues in terms of once you identify certain routes like this, and if the jurisdiction has anything to do with this, is that correct, Ann? Is that there is the issue of once you identify it, you probably have to begin then to address any types of deficiencies. Should something happen, God forbid, in any of those routes that we have talked about here, so something's going to point at you, most likely. And so that's an issue that I think that we face, but at the same time, this is the right thing to do in terms of trying to improve mobility
options for all folks. And Tim was kind enough to talk about the planning. So this is a great presentation in terms of on the ground, here are the routes, this is the software, hardware that does the stuff, and Tim is, oversees services that helps people plan those things. So there's a great connect here. And there's also the challenge, and also speaking for suburban jurisdictions of, we don't have the infrastructure, obviously, in terms of roadways, much like sidewalks in certain places, and then to be able to accommodate those. And I can't take credit for, by the way, for what Tim had talked about Public Works, because I think he dealt with another area with most likely our programming people that are looking at the transition plan issues and looking at the GIS layers. Is that correct, Tim? So that's no compliments for the last 20 years in my hand. So, again, I think it's a great issue, but I think that we tread carefully.
Yes, I think the key word there certainly is connect. The ability to connect your deficiencies to a plan to remediate them. We don't have to fear our deficiencies, and we all want to do the right thing. It's that if it's disconnected to remediation, if it's disconnected to a plan, and it just is. So we don't have to fear the data. We don't have to fear the information at all, but we cannot just have it and shelve it or love it. It has to be connected to real dollars, real plans, and real implementation in a tiered way, just like we do with our project selections, so that the money can go to the right place and do the most good in situations.
Very well said, Ms. Eskridge. Councilmember Curler.
Just really quickly, I'm in IT, and so I got curious. I went online, and I was expecting to download an app, and basically it looks like I just have something live. So it's an application, of course, but what is the nature of this beast?
It's a web application. So any browser can.
You just go to the site. So you don't have to download the app to run the app.
Yeah, we found that the majority of users with disabilities are trying to access this kind of information at home, so likely through other modes than tablets. In the last year, we've seen increased use in mobile types of devices, but probably as people become more familiar with the data and are trusting it, I think initially, as I know from my own experience, as I am trying to figure out where I can take my daughter and where we can traverse the environment, I will typically use a larger format computer so I can assess all the different data points in advance.
Right.
And our holy grail is for people to actually use this on their mobile devices eventually, because that it means that we can now spontaneously route people to their needs. When I go out with my daughter, nothing is unplanned. It's all has to be planned in advance. And if we were able to, in the middle of our business day, just take a little spontaneous jaunt over to a coffee shop, that is the holy grail for non-motorized mobility for special needs commuters.
Well, I am impressed by how much detail there is on this tiny phone that I have. And I don't know that you should get to a downloadable app. It just does make me dependent on the internet completely. Well, I guess an app would be too, like Waze is, but I'm very, very impressed by this, and I hope it keeps going. I hope if funders are around and they're looking at this, I thought this was a canned demo, and then I realized that no, it's actually there. I'm very, very impressed.
We actually, as Nick mentioned, we have real users, and some of them are not necessarily what one would consider special needs travelers. We have mothers with strollers, dads with strollers, people who've indicated to us that they're teaching their kids how to ride bikes and want to know what the accessible paths are and stay away from major streets. So.
The one last question was hours of the day. So I have damaged knees, and I've had stem cell treatment, and I'm not quite there. I can do the bicycle thing. But when I moved through Seattle, I almost laughed. I saw a route that was exactly like what I do and buildings that I depend on. But when I come back from Bainbridge on the weekends, see my parents, those same buildings aren't available to me. So does it do it by the hour so that you're clear that it's you're not going to be able to cut through the Exchange building or anything like that?
Yep, this is the example right here. I set it to say it's like 10 p.m. and now all the paths are on basically outdoor infrastructure. Yep.
Well, excellent conversation, colleagues. Dr. Caspi, Nick, Tim, anything you'd like to add in terms of final thoughts?
Thank you.
Thank you for having us here.
Gail, Kelly, anything you would like to wrap up with?
No, just I really appreciate the conversation and the feedback for us. So as Gil mentioned, we wanted to do this pilot project because this is great information for the city of Seattle. We have everybody else that we still need to work with. So very similar, we'll continue to coordinate with both. And as we continue to work down that path on implementation and doing these pilot projects, we'll definitely come back and see what the future holds from the board's direction moving forward. So thank you.
Folks, next month we've got on the tap to adopt the projects selected by our individual municipalities as part of our countywide processes. That's on the table for July the 12th at 9:30. Is there anything else for discussion for good of the order today? I'm not seeing any. Thanks to those who joined in person and those on the phone. We're adjourned.